Testing, testing. Perfect. Hey guys, I am here in my kitchen and I'm going to be doing a Q&A today. And I know I promised this to you a little over a month ago. I asked for your questions during the time that we were sheltering in. And you know what? I hadn't gotten around to it because I was still editing. And the 365 days of plants are almost finished. So we'll be finishing them up at the end of April. I know it's a bittersweet moment because some of you have really liked the 365 days of plants, and hopefully it kept you company during this time that many of us are actually sheltering in during the coronavirus. So I hope you are all well. I know that there has been some hardships and some tragedies through all of this, and I only hope that we could actually pull through this and work even harder to get things back in action when we can actually do them. So thank you so much for sticking with me, and thank you so much for sending me your questions. I have gotten several dozen of them, and I'm going to try to answer as many as possible. I think I have about 24 here, and if my video cuts out on me, I might have to do this as a part 2 as well. So, all right, let's begin with the first question. And this is from Carolina Rosso. Can I grow any plant with flowers indoors with medium indirect light? And by the way, if you see me looking down, it's because I have my computer down here and I'm looking at the questions. Okay, so Carolina, again, can I grow any plant with flowers indoors with medium indirect light? The short answer to your question is yes. And I think the question you could ask is what flowering plants actually grow in medium direct light, as opposed to what plants will flower in medium direct light. Because if you have a plant that has a flower that is a medium direct light growing plant, then yes, it will actually flower. And I have a few here that I pulled off to the side that are actually in bloom right now. This is Ruellia Makoyana, and you could see that this is a plant with a little bit more of the darker leaves, and you could actually see it in bloom. That's really pretty, right? As kind of this fuchsia color. I had showcased this in the Amazon Spheres tour, and this is actually sitting in my northeast facing window, which is actually right here. You could see I'm actually in my kitchen because the workroom was a little dark and the lighting here was better. But this gets really gentle light, and this is a plant that typically will grow in the understory of forests, so it's not growing in high light. In fact, if you grow this in high light, the leaves will probably start to flag and it probably won't do so well. So if this plant is a flowering plant and it's already growing in that kind of like medium indirect light, well then this will be one that will actually flower. And I have a few others here. This is my Calumnia here. You can see that that's in bloom. Some of them are a little bit past bloom, but this is commonly known as goldfish plant. And this one also has these like kind of red markings on the back, if you could see, really, really pretty. I mean, it's probably a little sign for pollinators, even when it's not in bloom, that this will have some yummy things coming. But this one is growing under my LED light strip, a little bit further off from my LED light strip underneath one of my shelf spaces. So that's kind of growing another typical plant that would grow in medium light conditions. And again, that's my Calumnia or my goldfish plant. And then this, you'll probably recognize this. This is formerly known as St. Paulia ionantha, which is a African violet. And you may have seen that I have featured this before in my 365 days of plants. And this is a plant that's almost always in bloom. I would say like 70 or 80% in bloom. And you don't want to be growing these in high light conditions. It just won't do well. So having that in a more medium light is great. And that's also growing underneath my shelf space with my little tiny LED light, which is not a grow light, by the way. It's just like a regular light. And then this one is not quite in bloom, but it blooms for like one day. You can see that some are budding right now. This is in the Dracaeana family. But this is Sideraceous fuscata, and I have showcased this. I think I've showcased this in 365 Days of Plants, and also in one of the easier plants to grow. 6 Easy Plants to Grow is another episode that I featured this in. Really nice fuzzy leaves, kind of that purplish velveteen feel. And this gets a nice, pretty lilac colored flower. And again, that is one that would typically grow in the understory, so you're getting a little bit more medium light, maybe even sometimes lower light conditions. And but all these plants will do better in more medium light compared to like low light. But yeah, so those plants that are typically growing in those conditions that have a flower will usually flower. So thank you so much for your question, and it was a great question to ask. So the next two I kind of grouped together, and I will credit both of you. So E3EFR asks, what's keeping you in the city? Could you be in the homestead boonies and have a bigger spot with the giant greenhouse? And Vatushi Kuganasen says, why are you staying in a small apartment? You can move to your new own apartment. If you are going to design your home, how would you design it? And when are you going to have the dream place with country living? So I think a lot of my viewers really want me to get out of the city and to spread my wings and start to grow in the country. I think that is such a lovely idea. I think many of you know that I grew up in the country. I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania with beautiful farms and fields and forests all around me. And I moved to the city in order to be able to express my creativity and to do things that typically I wouldn't be able to do in the country. You know, maybe now that I'm a little bit more established here, I mean, I still do have a lot of clients that I work with here. Maybe it would be time to kind of find something in the country as well. You know, I have a little bit of golden handcuffs here because the apartment I moved into is quite sizable for New York. I moved in here about 15 years ago in a place in Brooklyn where nobody wanted to live, you know, back in that day. So I kind of lucked out. And yeah, and obviously I have a lot of plants, so logistically figuring out how to move some things. But I don't think that would prevent me from considering those options. But one of the things that I think I would miss is a lot of my friends and the community that I've built here. So I think I would probably have to try to convince my friends to come with me. And I think like to answer Vatushi's question is, how would I design it? You know, if I had a place, I think it would really depend on if there is a house or a structure already there, because I'm really a firm believer of like working with what you have. Like I wouldn't want to just plop down any old place on a piece of land and have that, you know, cookie cutter on a different piece of land. I think you have to really kind of take in some of those permaculture principles of how does the land want to be planted? How does the land want to be built on? And really taking into consideration, you know, those things. Like if you have a southern exposure, that's going to be very different if you have a northern exposure and you're tucked behind like a mountain range or something. So I think all of these ideas get really exciting to me, and I love that you guys are asking these questions because you know, I have a community garden plot here in the city, and I manage a rain garden and a shade garden in the back. But it's kind of like illegal to plant in the ground here in the city. So if I do plant in the ground, if I kind of surreptitiously get something in, I kind of feel a little bit like a fugitive. So I don't want to feel like a fugitive when I plant something in the ground. You know, that kind of feels terrible. So yeah, so I'm anxious and eager to actually spread out a little bit more than what I have here in the city. But you know, all of this, you know, you have to come into with like responsibility and resources and time and, you know, friends and community and clients and all that other kind of stuff. So there's a lot that goes into it. But thank you guys for letting me imagine a little bit. All right, next question. Mr. Krabby Patty says, I often hear that you should repot a plant into a pot that's just the next size up. Does this really matter, or can I just plant a small plant into a much larger pot and let it grow into it? All right, so the thinking behind getting a plant and potting it into the next size up, so to speak, is because in some instances, plant roots, especially for smaller plants, especially like something like this, or like the African violet that I had showed you before. This just dropped a bunch of dirt on my computer. Never a good thing. Their root system doesn't grow that large. So if all of a sudden you put this into a, let's say a 6-inch or 8-inch pot, its root system will probably never grow out that far. And then you have, when you're watering it, you'll have all this wet soil around it. And that wet soil won't be taken up by the roots because there's no roots to take it up because the roots haven't grown out that way, because these are meant to be very compact plants. And so then that could actually invite a little bit more root rot and a little bit more bacterial infection, and it'll just kind of stay too moist in that soil. So that's the reasoning behind potting up in the next planter pot size up. However, if you have a plant with a very robust root system that has a tendency to grow like crazy, something that really comes to mind are some of those bird's nest anthuriums. If you ever pulled one of those out of the pot, they have these really thick, like almost like carrot type roots, you know, that look like fingers, white like fingers kind of going into the soil. And oftentimes when you pull one of those out, they'll be like, their roots will be roiling around. Those are the types of plants that if you put them into much larger pots, so say buy a bird's nest anthurium in a 6-inch pot, you could probably go with a 12-inch pot, and then those roots will find the edges of that planter pot and kind of expand. So that is a type of plant that would do that. I think of Chlorophytum comosum, which is hanging above my head here. I don't know if you could actually see a little bit of that, but those are the spider plants. Again, they have really robust root systems. Zamioculca samiofolia, if you saw that one episode of me doing the repot of the ZZ plants, I mean, those root systems are like tanks. And if you go several pot sizes up, then that shouldn't be a problem at all. So I think just like consider the plant that you're working with, and just know that if you go too big and the root system can't move out, you're going to risk having wet soil and then having that dampness and having the potential for root rot. So very good question. And I think that the next question that I have behind yours is almost the opposite of your question, with which Sweatashet 24 says, can we repot a plant from a big pot into a small pot? Many a times I get a plant that comes in a large nursery pot, even when the plants are small. So at first, when you asked this question, I was like, gosh, most of the time I get a plant in a nursery pot that's too small and there's too many roots, and they're like, the roots are kind of pushing out of the nursery pot and I have to like cut it out like as if it's in a girdle. But then I started to think, most recently I started to get these plants that have very tiny roots, and they're planted in a 4-inch or a 6-inch or an 8-inch pot. And I've been getting more of those. So your question is really applicable, and I want to address this. And the reason why I feel like I'm getting more of those is because there's so much demand for plants now that I think a lot of growers are just sticking a few stems in these nursery pots and trying to command a higher price because the garden center says, well, I want your 6 inches, and as opposed to like a 2.5-inch or 3-inch pot. And so these growers are getting pressured, and they're just sticking stems with very little root structure in these 4-inch or 6-inch or 8-inch pots and shipping them out the door. So I have gotten, in many cases, most recently, these pots where you pull them out and they barely have a root system on them, and I'm like, wait, what gives? So I do think that you could take those and actually plant them in smaller pots. And again, this goes back to the question that was asked earlier by Mr. Krabby Patty, why do you want to plant them in a smaller planter if the root system is not too robust? And it's because you can invite potential root rot. So yeah, so I would, if you want, before I have an episode up in the Houseplant 101 playlist, which is all about picking the right plant when you actually go shopping. And one of the things that you could do is actually check the roots in the plant. So you could actually take the plant out and check that it has a robust root system. Because I would rather one that's a little bit more robust and is kind of busting outside its pot rather than one that is too shallow and hardly rooted. So that is a good question to ask, and I'm glad you asked it because it's a very timely question, because it definitely is happening more often than now than it ever had even 2 or 3 years ago. Okay, so sorry if I'm butchering these Instagram names, but Dajok, I'd like to get a grow light for the top shelf of a bookshelf. It was a huge TV space that we're putting on our shelves. Do you have any pointers on having plants on tops of books, and what plant to grow there? Edible or occasional flower would be a bonus. And where do I get a 4-foot long grow light strip? So I don't have any pointers on growing on top of a book. Like I wouldn't necessarily have my planter pots on top of books, just because if you overwater it and then all of a sudden that water goes onto a book, you ruin your book. However, if you're talking about just a bookshelf, I think that's a great idea. I actually converted a number of my bookshelves that are already in kind of good light, because it's getting some southwest facing light. And so it's perfect because it was discoloring my books, and I'd rather grow plants there because you're getting great light. But I also have lights underneath those shelves. And what's great about that is that it's getting some top-down light, which you typically wouldn't have unless you had, some type of lighting from above, a skylight, for instance. And it's getting some additional light when, it might be like actually overcast, or if you're going through the winter months and it's a little bit more of a grayer day. So you're getting a constant bit of light, and you could also have that on a timer, and I would highly recommend some of the digital timers out there. I could even link to some of the digital timers below, because you just don't have to worry about actually turning on and turning off your lights. You just have it on for a 12-hour run. Maybe it's from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or something like that, and you don't even have to worry about it. Now, for your question about different kinds of light strips, I have multiple different kinds of light strips, and I could link to them down below. I also have them in my Amazon storefront, or my kit.co storefront as well. And I actually have both LED strips as well as fluorescent light strips. And these are the types of light strips that you could have, that you could connect to one another. So you could buy a 2-foot strip and then connect it to another one, and then connect it to another one, and still have it plugged in. Or you could just have them side by side and not connected to one another. So there's so many different things that you could do. I would just say that the fluorescent light strip that I have growing under one shelf runs a little hotter than if you get an LED light. And the fluorescent light strip, if you have plants that grow up towards it, like I have a Peperomia ferrare that kind of grew up towards it with the inflorescence, and it started to burn because it doesn't know any better, and it's growing up towards the light, and the light is really hot. So if you want something that is a little less hot, then you would get probably one of those LED light strips. And I will give you links to some of the ones that I would recommend. I also just featured one recently that if you saw kind of more space for your plants episode that I recently did, there's an LED light strip that's not a grow light strip, and you could just touch it and it turns on. It's so cute and it's so cool, and it's very affordable. So it's not marketed as a grow light, but it's pretty effective. It just depends on how close your shelves are. Like if your shelf is like very far away, like 4 feet, then it's probably not going to do much because it's not meant to be a grow light. But if you're growing a cute plant like this underneath it, which I have this plant growing under the LED light strip, you can imagine that the LED light strip is about right here. And so it's only about 1 inch to 2 inches away from the plant. So it's getting a lot of great top-down light. And that's why you have this kind of growth structure that I have here, where it's kind of lifting its leaves right up to the light. It's really kind of enjoying that. Whereas if I grew this in a window, it'd probably have everything kind of flopped over to the side unless I kind of turn it around, so that it kind of evens itself out. So, and then what you grow there, I mean, it's really up to you, and it really also depends on how much light and the intensity of light and how long you leave the light on. But what I like about having a grow light underneath a shelf is oftentimes you don't have to like look at it directly. Because sometimes the grow lights could be a little bit intense, and you don't want to be, walking around in your house, and it's kind of the antithesis of having a really cozy home, having a grow light everywhere. So having them under shelf spaces kind of hides that intensity of that light a little bit more. So, but the ones I recommend are going to have a little bit of a whiter light and are easier on the eyes. So you could take a look at that in the description, but also I will have it in my Amazon storefront and my kit.co. All right, so Jacob Wright here says, I was forced to move out of my college dorm because of COVID and move somewhere else, but now I have 14 bright indirect loving plants, and the only place I was able to find has essentially zero light. Oh, that's so sad. Do I just buy a bunch of grow lights, and what do I do? Okay, so Jacob, first of all, it's so hard to be somebody who's in college right now, especially those who are actually graduating, because everything has just been completely upended. And for those who are graduating into this kind of market, I mean, my thoughts are with you. It's just a really troublesome time to actually get out there. It sounds like you're in college, Jacob, for a little while, and that you're in your dorm and you actually moved out with your plants. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of related to the question that we just had, but I think that if you have an apartment with zero light, there's nothing you could do. You can't just like puncture a hole in the wall and put a window. So I would recommend a grow light, and I'll actually put some more grow light options down below. As a matter of fact, this is a little on the expensive side, but I have Soltech solution lights. I have 3 of them. They're a little bit more pendant shape. You could hang them all different places. I'll leave my code down below, summer15, because it'll give you 15% off if you order anything there. And I'll have also recommendations for strip lights. So again, if you have shelving or even temporary shelving, even if you have a piece of IKEA furniture and you want to just put like lights underneath that, and you just want to put your 14 plants right there because you have no windows, then I would recommend it. And actually your plants will probably be better for it because it'll be more consistent lighting throughout the day, as opposed to, again, having those days where it might be a little bit grayer or rainy and your plants aren't getting any light. So you might see a lot of new growth in your zero light apartment if you just get some grow lights. So hopefully that's helpful. Okay, Honora Crescent says, at what point in the new year do you start to fertilize your cacti? Is March too soon? So March has come and gone, and I know I asked these questions, back in probably early March. So again, sorry, Honora, for not being able to answer your question in time. But you may have seen some of my Instagram posts that I had mentioned that a lot of my cacti and other plants as well started to put out new growth earlier this season than I have ever seen before. So in February, they started to put on new growth. And I was shocked by that because I don't typically actually start fertilizing until March, to answer your question, but I usually let my plants dictate as to when I should actually fertilize them. So as soon as I started to see the new growth, within 1 to 2 weeks within February, I started to lightly fertilize my plants with an organic fertilizer. And your plants are just starting out. They're just starting some new growth. And I don't know where you are. So, I'm in the Northeast and I'm answering this question as if like everybody's in the Northeast, but I know that's not the case. Look, it's like winter in Australia right now. So you're probably wanting to do the opposite. Australia is going to go through a growing season when it's basically our winter. So I'm, keep that in mind when I'm actually answering these questions. But I started to fertilize actually back in February, and it was because we had a very, mild winter and a lot more light than usual. It was like spring very early. And when I posted it on Instagram, a number of other people in the Northern Hemisphere also confirmed that their plants are out and putting new growth. So if you use a synthetic fertilizer, I would say, really reduce the amount of synthetic fertilizer just during that early parts of the growing season, because again, there's not much growth happening. But as soon as you start to see it, then you could actually start to do a little bit of fertilizing. So if you saw it in March, then you could start doing it in March. April's not too late, obviously. So you could continue to fertilize. And keep in mind that not all cacti and succulents have growth periods in the summer months. So some actually go dormant in the summer months, or should go dormant in the summer months. Of course, that could get a little bit wonky when you're growing in an indoor environment and you're giving it pretty consistent light and warmth and everything all year round. So again, this is where I would err to the side of like not listening to the guru or any guru, but to listen to your plants instead as to when they probably need it. All right, great question. All right, Britt here says, can I use outdoor gardening soil as soil for my houseplants? Short answer, I would say, is no. And let's talk about outdoor soil, outdoor gardening soil that you buy in a bag, and potting medium that you buy for indoor plants. So when we think about soil outside, we usually speak about it in sand, silt, and loam. And you'll notice that we don't talk about that with like outdoor gardening soil in a bag or indoor potting medium. That's not how we talk about soil in those packaged mixes. But for outdoor gardening soil, you want something that's like crumbly, but it's usually much denser than your indoor potting medium. And your indoor potting medium is really light and fluffy. You know, if you had to lift up an outdoor gardening bag and an indoor potting medium, the outdoor gardening bag would be really heavy compared to the indoor potting medium, because the indoor potting medium usually has very dehydrated peat. It has perlite. It might be made out of cocoa fiber. It might have vermiculite in it. It might have repurposed like wood. Whereas outdoor gardening soil might be filled with like more compost. And by the way, the people in the UK often say compost for potting medium. So what I mean by compost is kind of like degraded organic product, if you will. So gardening soil should be crumbly but denser. So it has a completely different property. And when you're working with soil on the outside, there's a lot of external forces that are at play, like earthworms. You know, I was just digging in the community garden the other day, and there's like all these grubs and like little tiny flies and bugs and fungi and all this kind of stuff that's interacting in that kind of environment that you do not get in a container environment indoors. So that's why you have to have something that's very airy and light for the indoor medium, because you're not getting a lot of those external features like the earthworms and things that are aerating your soil for you. So keep your outdoor gardening soil for your outdoors. Keep your potting medium for the indoors for your indoor plants. And if you're in an urban environment and you're not testing your soil, then do not use the outside soil unless you test it. And I have an episode on that, on testing and the importance of testing your urban soils. So don't take your soil from outside and put it into your planter box. If you're in a more rural context, and you know that your soil is good, or you've tested your soil out there, then oftentimes if you have a raised bed, then you could use your soil from outside and put it in. But yeah, so good question. I think it's probably a question on everybody's minds, especially for those of us who are planting both indoors and out. Okay, so the next question is from Christine Yu. How do you know if a plant needs a post? I have so many plants that need a post. In fact, I have this philodendron Bietier. I'm going to pull it into frame here, as you can see. This was featured on my 365 Days of Plants, and that is a plant that totally needs a post, but I just have not enough post space and not enough place in order to be able to post these plants. But a lot of plants that are like aroids, that are philodendrons, monsteras, you have epiprenums, you have syndapsis. They're the types of plants that actually grow in the forest, and they'll send out like these stems with tiny little leaves, and once they see a tree or feel a tree or sense a tree, then they will start to grow up, and then their leaves will start to get bigger. And in some cases, like philodendrons, they may even change shape. Or in the case of some monsteras, they might get these fenestrations or these windows, these little holes like cut in them. So a lot of botanists or plant biologists will refer to them as juvenile leaves until they actually can grow up on a tree. And what the plant is doing is searching for more light so they could put out more leaves and bigger leaves. And the challenge is that you could still grow plants on a post in your house, but if you don't have a skylight or a grow light coming down, then it's not going to be growing and getting much light. So the plant leaves might actually stay the same size, or might still stay kind of juvenile if it's not getting that light, even if it's growing up on the post. But typically what happens is you'll see the growth structure of plants that are like, that are kind of vining, and you'll see adventitious roots, some aerial roots kind of growing out that would like to grasp and grab on things. And you'll start to see maybe the leaves are starting to get smaller as opposed to larger. So that's when you think like, oh, this plant I should probably post. And you know, some of the common plants that we have, like Epiprenum aureum, which is our devil's ivy or golden pothos it's called, or Scindapsus pictus, which is our satin pothos or silver pothos, those are ones that are actually sold as hanging basket plants to us. But in the natural environment, they will actually grow up trees, and in the case of Scindapsus pictus, will actually start to shingle and oppress itself on a flattened surface on the vertical surface that it's growing up on. So even though we grow those usually as hanging basket plants, I have a Scindapsus pictus here that's hanging and then found its way onto a wall, and it started to oppress itself and flatten itself on the wall, which is like super cool, because typically they don't shingle like that. But I also have a grow light above, so it's actually probably pretty happy right there. I also have an Epiprenum Cibo blue in my bathroom that has also found, it kind of stuck its like aerial root onto the wall and started to, you know, oppress itself onto the wall. So that's pretty cool. So again, look at the growth structure of your plant, and if you have the space, I don't always have the space, but if you have the space, you could actually give it, you know, like a sphagnum pole, or put it up on a wooden pole or something along those lines. Or if you have the right kind of wall, then maybe it'll start to actually clamber on your wall if you're lucky. Ivy is like that too, I should say. Ivy, I actually ruined some of the paint on my walls because it has all these like little fuzzy rootlets that come out, and then it wants to vine. Or you might have a plant, let's see if I could actually go and grab this one, if I can reach past. Oh boy. Okay, yeah, okay, here we go. Sorry. So this one is a type of vining cucumber, and it actually goes deciduous. So it loses its leaves in the winter months, and it starts to get these little tendrils. Let's see if I could show you this little tendril kind of coming out, if you could see that. And that will want to vine onto something. And I also have these plants, I don't have one around here, that kind of look like these green sticks. And sometimes they will want to climb onto something. Another vining cucumber that's quite common is Xerocissus danguii, and I also featured that. It's called the silver dollar plant on 365 Days of Plants. And that is another kind of vining cucumber. It's very succulent, but it also will stick out these tendrils. And oftentimes when you see something with tendrils, it wants to affix itself onto something. So there's a lot of cool strategies that plants have. Sometimes a zigzag kind of structure, and that will help like hook them onto things. So take a look at the form and the structure of your plant, because you'll get a sense as to whether that will need a post or would want a post, because not always the time, you can't always give the plant what it needs all the time, so unfortunately. All right, next question is from Singh Shriyash. So I would like to know about your education and how you got into plants. Okay, so Shriyash, I actually answered this question in another Q&A session back in January. It was a 3-part Q&A session, and I think it's called like My Education. And I answer people's questions about education and botany and plants in general. So I'm going to refer you to that, and I'll try to link it in a card above as well. And if I run out of cards, I will link it in the description below. So again, thank you so much for that question, but because I've already answered it in another one, I'm going to direct you there. Improbable squid. I'm having trouble with Tillandsias. They're fine, I guess, but they're not growing at all. I've had them for over a year now, and I've seen no sign of growth on them. One of them has blushed red, but it faded soon after blooming. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Help. All right, so in problem with squid, you might not actually be doing anything wrong with your Tillandsias, especially if they're kind of chugging along. The main thing is you just have to be very patient, because this is not the type of plant like a golden pothos, which will like just, push out leaves and stems like in an insane amount of time, or like even potatoes or sweet potatoes, which will, start putting out green. Air plants, let me see if I have one here. I think I brought one out somewhere. Oh, here we go. So this is my little Tillandsia ionantha, and this is one that I featured on 365 Days of Plants, and you see that there's this like second little one coming right up here. It took so long to get it to be this size, so long, because this was the only one I had, and I've had this for several years, and it just took forever. And this is in a little glass ball, and these Tillandsia ionanthas, these are probably the ones that are the most common, and they're the ones that are most amenable to like growing indoors. But I've featured, Tillandsia bulbosa, I featured Tillandsia xerographica, streptophila. There's a number of others, and some of them are a little bit more challenging than others, but I think it's just about patience. If you had it a little over a year is not enough time, especially if you're not growing it in like super optimum conditions. I mean, if you think about it, like sometimes I forget to water my Tillandsias all the time. I'll switch up fertilizing sometimes. You have to make sure that the airflow is there so it doesn't rot. They just need a different kind of routine than your regular plants, and you just have to be much more patient with it. So I don't think you're probably doing anything wrong. I think you're doing probably everything right, and then you just need to give yourself a little bit more time with them, okay? So thank you again for your question, and check back in like 2 years. Okay, so Ray Zhao Runfai. I have spider mites on my English ivy, oh no! And I've been putting it in front of a humidifier. Is it going to work, or do I have to use alcohol and neem oil? Oh, spider mites, God bless you on your English ivy. English ivy is, it's just it almost should say, just like have a sign in it and say, I love spider mites, bring me home. It's tough. I had an English ivy for years with not spider mites, but with scale, and it really chugged along. But spider mites are a little bit challenging. If you actually see the spider mites and you see the webbing, it might unfortunately be a little bit too far gone. But I will give you this advice, and I don't know if you have this available to you, but if you have some kind of shaded area outside that you could put your English ivy, then I would recommend that you do that. If you have a hose, I would first really hose down the ivy, and then in a shaded area outside, actually put it outside. And the reason for that is sometimes you get beneficial insects that could come and actually feast on the spider mites. And I actually did that with my adenium, which is a desert rose. It didn't have spider mites, but it had mealybugs. And it needs bright light anyway, so I usually put it out in late spring outside, because it gets these really beautiful fuchsia blooms if you give it proper kind of light. And I noticed all the mealybugs were gone, because I think some of the beneficial insects came and actually attacked those mealybugs, and the plant is just wonderful. It goes dormant in the winter, which I think helps. When it drops its leaves, like a lot of the insects actually go away. So with spider mites though, they're a little bit more challenging, and if you're seeing that webbing, it might be time to kind of move your plant out. But if you, ivy is really easy to propagate, because it has those little furry adventitious roots that I had mentioned before, and you could take sections of it. If there's a section that you feel does not have any spider mites, you might be able to take some of those and repropagate them again. And try to do it in a new soil where there might not be any kind of spider mite eggs or anything like that could have fallen down into the soil. And I would make sure that you're giving that plant a little less light, because sometimes, even though English ivy will grow in bright light conditions indoors, sometimes if it gets one bad burn, it will invite some spider mites in, and you don't want your other plants, if you have other plants, getting affected by that. So take a look at it. I wish you the best of luck. I have some, things on spider mites as well, but with English ivy and doing alcohol and neem oil, it might be a little bit too far gone. All right. Okay, so next one. I'm rifling through these guys, but there's a lot. Urban Arcadia. How do you feel about having more than one type of plant per pot, like 2 types of philodendrons from the same environment in nature climbing the same pole from a shared pot as well? I like that idea. I mean, especially if you have, and I actually do that in my house, so especially if you have a deep-rooted plant and you have some more superficial growing plants. So I have like my Ficus lyrata, I have my aspidistra, and my anthurium, which have these deep roots, but then I have some begonias and phoetonias and sideraceous that has a little bit smaller roots up on top, so they're not really fighting their root zones. So yeah, I like that idea, and I think it really fills out a pot. I think the challenge would be just watering it and making sure that all the plants are getting water all the way around your planter pot. So I like that idea, and I think it actually looks really good. Okay, Methy, why are my pothos leaves curling inside? Okay, so what I think that means is like they're not flat and they're kind of going like this. And typically what happens when that happens is that it's protecting itself maybe from water loss. So maybe if the light is intense, that it's starting to curl, or if you're not giving it enough water in relation to the light that you're giving it, or you're just letting it dry out, then it's probably going like that. Or Methy, I would actually ask you to find out whether you can look at any of the leaves and see if they have a fuzzy whiteness to them, because it may actually also be mealybugs. And the reason why I mention that is because sometimes I'm watering my plant, the plant's leaves are flagging or curling under, and I'm like, wait, I've watered this plant, it should not have any water stress. And then I look very closely, and like in the gaps of the leaves and in the petiole, they will have mealybugs. And mealybugs will suck the juices out of the plant, and the plant's not really getting any nutrients or water, and it's starting to curl inwards. So that's something else. If it's also starting to curl inwards and you think it's fine and you're watering it very well, I would actually check its roots, because sometimes if the roots are not getting enough water, or if the roots are dead or decaying, or they have root rot, then that means the rest of the plant is not getting water to the tips or the tops of its leaves. So those are all kind of interrelated issues that I would definitely check in regards to your pothos leaves curling. All right, next question. We don't have many more questions. Maybe like a half dozen more. Grizzly Berg, the bottom leaves on my Dracaeana reflexa and marginata are falling off rapidly. Is it dehydrated or is it root rot? Well, there's a lot more questions that I have for you, Grizzly Berg, about your Dracaeana. And if the bottom plant leaves are falling off, like one, I would say, did you get this recently? Because sometimes, even with my Dracaeana that I brought in, I had to get rid of it, unfortunately. But it was probably growing in really optimum conditions. I put it in a really darker light condition, unfortunately. It wasn't much light, low light condition, because one of my other Dracaeanas was doing well, but it doesn't mean that another Dracaeana will do well. And it just started to drop leaves. And oftentimes, when it starts to drop leaves, it means that it's just acclimatizing to the place, because it was a different light condition, and all of a sudden it's just reorienting and saying, I don't need all these leaves, I only need some leaves, and I need to put them up on top or wherever the light is. Maybe it's like putting leaves all on one side and losing it on one side. So that could be a possibility. The other thing is like, where are you growing it? Because oftentimes if you're growing it not directly in a window, but you're growing it below a window, it will want to lose its leaves on the bottom because the window's not facing that stem. And if it has more light up on top, that's where it's going to put its energy to put its leaves. So that could be another option. Dehydrated or root rot? I mean, I think that if it's dehydrated, the first thing it'll probably do is flag its leaves. So it'll be like a little bit more droopy leaved. So I don't think it would lose its leaves right away. It would probably give you an indication if it's dehydrated. And root rot, you could always, check it out. You could pull out the roots, but if the roots look healthy, then it's probably not dehydration or root rot. It's probably the fact that you are giving it some kind of light in a place and it's trying to optimize its leafage and where it's going to put that foliage. Great question though, and I think probably a lot of people have that kind of question. All right, I'm trying to rifle through these because I don't want this to be too long. Adrian Smiths, what are some of the native species of plants in your area, and do you keep any of them? Okay, so Adrian, there's so many native plants in my area. Outside, I could think of like in the Rayne garden, we planted golden Alexanders and purple coneflower and sweet Joe Pye weed. Tree-wise, I planted a cornus, which is a type of dogwood, and Cercis canadensis, which is eastern redbud. Really beautiful plants. Violets, we have a lot of wild violets. Trillium, all the trilliums are coming up. I have, what else? I mean, there's so much. I can't even think of the ones that I was about to say. Witch hazel, which is really lovely. It gets these like yellow kind of tattered flowers in the winter months, so it kind of blooms through winter. I actually mentioned that plant in my book because I have fond memories of that as a kid. And I don't keep any indoors, and the reason for that is a lot of those plants need to go through a cold period, and I usually keep my house at a normal temperature of 60-something to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and a lot of our native plants here in the Northeast, because I'm not in a subtropical, tropical area, you wouldn't be able to keep indoors for very long because they need that cold period, and a lot of those plants are deciduous, and they have their root system growing underneath the frozen zone, and then they start to grow back up again. So I'm seeing a lot of new growth this spring from the plants that I had planted a year and 2 years ago, and they're really wonderful. And I think that more people need to look at their native species and start growing native species outdoors. There's been a huge trend to grow more Asian species here, and there's been some interesting research to show that our native pollinators like honeybees, or sorry, not honeybees, but like bumblebees and solitary bees actually don't do as well with those Asian varieties. Even the berries of some Asian variety of trees don't actually really feed our birds for those to actually eat the seeds and the fruits as well as our native species. So getting reacclimated to our native species is just like really wonderful. And actually I keep a spreadsheet of native species now too to help with like planting plans, which who knows, maybe like my fertilizer spreadsheet for indoor plants, maybe I'll start, putting that out there. But it's really wonderful to be able to grow plants outdoors as well as indoors. So thanks for those questions. Britt here, I think you already asked a question, but this is another great one. Do I need to mix worm castings into the soil, or can I dress the top layer of soil with them? And can I use liquid fertilizer and worm castings together, or is that considered over-fertilizing? So worm castings are just what worms, if you vermicompost, which is worm composting, it's basically their poop, and they come out and they eat all the, newspaper or vegetable matter, and they'll have this really nice slow release fertilizer. Their poop could actually be used as slow release fertilizer. And what that means is that all of those yummy micronutrients and macronutrients will not be available for the plant right away. So that's what it means by having a slow release. Now your question is, can I put it on the top or mix it in? Either or. If you put it on the top, when you water the plant, it will slowly trickle down to the rest of the plant, provided that you're watering very thoroughly. Now you ask about using a liquid fertilizer and worm castings together. That's an excellent question. And my question to you is, are you using an organic liquid fertilizer or a synthetic liquid fertilizer? And those two things matter because an organic liquid fertilizer usually has a lower NP or K value, that's nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, whereas synthetic has a higher nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium level. And if you're using synthetic fertilizer with slow release, I would say just diluting the synthetic fertilizer a little bit more and using the slow release fertilizer or the worm castings, it still should be fine because, again, that worm casting is not going to be released all at once, and you might actually have some interesting micronutrients in there that is not in the synthetic fertilizer. And if you're using liquid organic fertilizer, which again is not synthetic and it has a lower NPK value, then you're, again, probably not going to be over-fertilizing because that liquid fertilizer is very gentle if it's organic, and it'll be more readily available because it's liquid, but the castings will just release over time. So I don't think you're gonna have anything to worry about. Bubble plants. What is one common house plant that you have little to no experience with? I would say like, I just did an episode with Amar in the Netherlands, and he had all these palms, and there are lots of palms that are common houseplants, like a majesty palm, something I wouldn't usually recommend for like my living environment. And I don't really have much experience with it. So that episode, I'll link to it. If I have another card, I'll link to it. It's just amazing because Amar has so many palms, a lot of the plants that he remembers growing up with in Suriname. And I was just in awe because I don't grow a lot of palms. I have a Chamadora Metallica that I started to grow that I mentioned in 365 Days of Plants. And that's great because it's like more of an understory palm. But some of those other palm trees, forget it. I wouldn't be able to grow it in my house. So I don't have as many experiences in regards to that. So I have to rely on other people who are growing them in order to be giving solid advice from their own experience. Okay, a few more questions. Guai Ho, would you be making a business related to plants? For example, like selling pots, plants, and other products? Well, I am trying to make a business out of what I'm doing already, and it's not necessarily selling products. I mean, I'm actually wearing my Forever Kippy shirt, which I do have, and my houseplant masterclass, which really does help not only pay for some incidentals, but also helps fund these Plant One On Me's. But I have actually thought about doing different types of businesses, but I'm so grateful I didn't actually take something on, especially during this time with the coronavirus and the pandemic, because that just, a lot of businesses are really struggling right now, small businesses and businesses that have taken on investment that are like wild cards and non-essential businesses, and it's just a real struggle. So, and I have started venture-backed businesses before, and I love starting things and steering the ship for a while, but to get it to a big size, to manage people, it starts to pull on different skill sets. It may not be as enjoyable. So I have to really think hard about that kind of stuff. You want to keep something small and manageable, but you also want to grow it. And do I want to get into that mindset again? I mean, it's a really hard mindset to get into. And if you don't have the right kind of partners, it could be really challenging and a real struggle. So yeah, I mean, I've definitely thought about it, but I think it's about getting the right kind of partners, the right kind of mindset, and doing it well and doing it right and really thinking through it and not just kind of doing something on a whim. But this has been an experimentation for me for the last 3 years. So I'm really open to ideas and to things like that feels right for the time. To launch it. But in the meantime, I'm just, doing the Forever Kippy collection, doing this channel, taking sponsorship here and there, which is always very helpful, and being able to market my masterclass. So thank you all, the hundreds of people who have taken the masterclass so far. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you're enjoying all the different changes that we have to it, and that it helps fuel a lot of these Plant One On Me's. So thank you guys for that. Okay, Plant Exicon. What advice would you give to a 15-year-old who wants to collect plants? Okay, so in my January Q&A, I gave advice to some teenagers who want to study plants. Okay, talking too much because my camera cut me off. But if you want to collect plants, I would say that go to your family members. I mean, sometimes your grandparents or somebody within your family will actually have plants, and you could go and ask for a cutting. Even maybe some of the stores that you would typically frequented. If you see something that's growing, ask maybe the store manager to see if you could actually take a cutting of a plant. No money required, no monetary exchange required. I think that's some of the best ways, and hopefully when we could start gathering again, and we could start doing plant swaps, that's another great way. If you're set up for it, one of the cheapest ways to get plants is through seed. And even though it could be challenging seed starting indoors, you could probably make it work even under a regular light bulb lamp light if you don't have a grow light. and just kind of some starter soil and stuff like that. So you could probably get I'm actually starting seeds right now on a wet paper towel with some saran wrap on a warm kind of base, and then I moved it under a grow light lamp light and just spraying it a little bit more. So there's so many. I just kind of feel like where there's a will, there's a way, and if you want to get involved in this space, you will find different ways in order to be able to do it. And people are generous. They'll like empathize with you. And like, that's why I said, if you're like a, young kid and you go in there and you're like, I really want to collect plants. Is it possible to get a cutting of this plant? Most people will actually, take a little cutting and give it to you right there on the spot. So I would recommend, that. And again, look into seeds. Seed starting is really fun. And going to your family and friends who might have some plants as well, and getting some cuttings from them, and then getting your family into them if your family's not already into plants. It's very infectious, I have to say, in a good way. All right, Crystal Clear Dreamer. My question may seem rather silly, no silly questions, but I have a vast collection of plants, and I went to Lowe's a week ago in the outside plant area of the store, and because I was in such a hurry to get in and out, I ASAP grabbed a soil that was all-purpose. But can a soil be all-purpose? That's a really great question. I think all-purpose soil generally means that if you plant just any plant in the soil, it should be fine. And, I look at a lot of the greenhouse growers, and a lot of the greenhouse growers grow lots of different types of plants, like epiphytic plants, plants that are normally growing in the ground with a more composty peat mixture, all that other kind of stuff. And they're growing them in the same soil throughout, and they're giving them very similar conditions. So all-purpose, I kind of feel like means that it's airy enough, that it's fluffy enough, and that it should be fine for most plants. Now, I would argue that if maybe you're trying to grow an orchid, which typically is in kind of this fir bark or the sphagnum bark mix, that would be a little bit more challenging. So there's always exceptions. There's definitely plants that probably won't do as well in all-purpose mix. And if it maybe, for instance, a cactus on its own roots that is very sensitive and would probably work best in a rockier kind of airy soil. And you'd have to be very cautious not to overwater it and kind of destroy the roots, if that makes sense. So you could probably make it work, but it would really depend on the care tip for that particular plant. But since most of our houseplants and most of the plants that they sell at a place like Lowe's are, traditional houseplants, you could probably get away with an all-purpose mix. I don't know if that really answered your question, but that's kind of how I would answer it. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. All right, last question, bubble plants. How do you manage to post so much content and avoid feeling burned out after so much of it? Sometimes, like these Q&As, I couldn't get around to actually filming because I didn't feel like filming. And then the times when I feel like filming, the lighting wasn't really that good because I like to use a little bit more natural light. So I don't always feel up for filming, but I think how I've been able to do this for the 3 years that I have, if I could be really honest with myself and with you, is that I try to be more prepared. So even with the 365 days of houseplants, people are like, how are you filming it every day? I didn't film it every day. I tried to film as much in a given day, and then I would go through and edit them all. And sometimes I would max out, and I've said this before, I would max out maybe in 30 plants. Sometimes I'd push it to 40 in a day. It's a lot of filming. And I'd be really tired after that end of the day, and I wouldn't want to film for weeks afterwards. So I think the only way I was able to do it is just to be prepared and to set up more efficient workflows and not to feel so overwhelmed, especially because I'm not just doing the videos, like I'm going about my day, and I'm, cooking for myself, and I'm working on other client work, and I like to write, so I need to really be in my headspace to write. And I have to go take care of the chickens, which actually it's about that time to go take care of the chickens again. And so there's other things that I need to do, and I think that breaks up the day, but also just feeling prepared. I'm the one who does not like to wait last minute to do my homework, that kind of stuff. So being able to be a little bit more prepared, and I wouldn't have launched 365 Days of Plants if I didn't think I had the workflow set up. And I do have a Q&A about that, where, Sonder has helped me with the workflow. He's my camera person and one of my greatest friends in the whole world. And he has really helped me think through the workflow of how to actually do this. He helped teach me how to edit, which is very helpful because I could edit on myself. I've had an editor, Ellery, to edit, probably 10 or 11 or so of the videos, and that's been really helpful. So being able to actually delegate some responsibility out to other people, even though I don't have like a huge team of people, it's just primarily me and then Sonder, who comes in if he can to help film some stuff, and Ellery once in a while to come and edit. But otherwise, it's just about evening it out through the day and not doing too much, and being well rested, eating as well as you possibly could be, and making your day a little bit more varied so it doesn't feel like you're a slave to what you do. Because I think once you start to feel like a slave to what you do, then you're not going to enjoy it. And the reason why I love doing this stuff is because I enjoy it. I enjoy sharing my enthusiasm with all of you, and I create content that really makes me come to life, and I hope I create content that is enjoyable for some folks out there, and so I think that keeping that in mind and making sure that that's always what I'm striving for, and not feeling like I'm running after myself, and feeling like I'm actually in a good place with it all. So thank you so much, Bubble Plants, for that question, and thank you for all of your questions and for submitting questions. And I will definitely do another Q&A down the road. So check out for my Instagram posts on Homestead Brooklyn. I usually post it there and ask people what their questions are. And and enjoy the rest of the Plant One On Me series. I have a lot more coming in the coming days, and hopefully we won't all be sheltering in throughout the summer, but I know we'll probably still be taking precautions out there with the coronavirus. So guys, stay safe, stay smart, and enjoy the rest of Plant One On Me. Bye guys.